Hi, I'm Ted Haftegabber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
First, congratulations. I don't know if you've heard the news, but Poverty by America is #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. So I want to start on a hopeful note, because we won't stay hopeful the whole time we're in conversation today. And what does that signal to you about the resonance of what you found out and wrote about it? What does that say about the collective will to end poverty in America?
Yeah, it's so great to see you. It's such an honor to be in conversation with you. You've done so much at the national level to lead this conversation on poverty and make sure our ambitions match the scope of the problem. So appreciate you, Michael, everything you do. I'm encouraged. I think a lot of us want to have this conversation. You know, I think a lot of us are done with all this poverty and desperation and deprivation in our own backyards. And I think that there's a signal that we can send to our political leaders, to our corporate leaders, that we can actually talk about this problem, not just talk about inequality or economic opportunity, but actually talk about poverty, the fact that millions and millions of us can't afford basic necessities every year. So I'm encouraged, I'm encouraged by that signal, but I'm encouraged by conversations like this where a lot of folks are coming out to tackle this issue together.
And let's start with sort of you and your upbringing. You talk about in the early parts of the book being a PK, a pastor's kid.
Yeah.
And sort of seeing the work of your family, your mother and father, and preaching the gospel, et cetera, and also the struggles with economic insecurity. So can you talk about how both those have influenced the way you think about poverty and the way you think about solutions to the problem?
Yeah, so we grew up tight. Our gas got shut off often. We lost our home before it was all the rage. When I was in college, and I remember feeling embarrassed about that, shameful about that. But I also was just confused because I went to college, I went to my state school, and I just saw a lot of my friends with money, just a lot of money. And I think it made me, ask, why is this the way that this rich nation handles a situation when a family falls on hard times? I also think, growing up in the church, religion was like our everything, right? It was the air we breathed, it was the language we talked, and so often when I'm connecting to this issue, I think I am channeling a kind of a moral force, that I think comes from a faith tradition.
And I know my friend Joseph McKellar from Pico, California, and folks from Pico, California are here, and I know they've been leading a conversation in the state about poverty being a moral issue and went deeply embedded in faith. And I guess my follow-up question to your answer would be, what commentary do you have about the fact that, at least in 2023 America, faith has been hijacked to be sort of something that reproduces poverty, or something that says the status quo is actually God ordained? Like, how does what thoughts, commentary, feelings do you have about that, particularly given how you grew up in the work you're doing now?
Yeah, I hate poverty. I hate it. And when I read Isaiah 61, when God is like, I, the Lord, hate robbery. I love justice. I connect with that part of the faith tradition. Faith Communities of America have taken leadership roles in ending hunger, in getting the Affordable Care Act passed, in addressing homelessness. I hope they take a role in poverty abolitionism as well. One way to do that I've always been puzzled by is a lot of churches and other faith communities are sitting on a lot of capital. They own a lot of land. They got a lot of money. They could totally undercut the payday lending industry, right? They could say, okay, the guys on the corner, they're charging you 500% to take out a loan so you can pay your rent so you don't get evicted. We're gonna charge you no interest. You just have to have 2 folks in the congregation vouch for you. Or, we're gonna undercut that with our capital. I think that's a very tangible way the faith community can get involved in a way they're not today. Yeah.
I'm going to put a linchpin on that because I want to talk about solutions in a second. But I want to make sure everyone, because everyone hasn't read the book yet. It just came out. We all bought it. It's the #1 New York Times bestseller. But let's talk about the problem, right? So you speak to the fact that we've had a war on poverty.
Yeah.
You speak to the fact that we do spend some amount of I think you have a line in the book about how people are saying we spend so much on war versus the GDP, but maybe that's not the right comparison to make. So help orient us in the arguments you make in the book about why do we have so much poverty given the fact that we have 120, I don't know all these people. Do you know all these people? We have all these people, many of whom we don't.
These people.
You might. We have all these people here who we don't know who are interested in this conversation. You had the same crowd like this last night. You had a crowd like this the night before, and locales throughout the country, and yet we have a lot of poverty. So can you walk us through sort of all the ways in which poverty is manufactured by policy, by design, and it's not like a bunch of people decided not to work or decided to be lazy or decided that, you know what, I don't want to make a living wage.
Tommy Orange, the California novelist, has this line where he says, kids are jumping out of the windows of burning buildings, falling to their deaths, and we think that the problem is that they're jumping. And
Wait, say that again. That was deep. I don't think everyone, heard 3 ums, but it should have been a collective So say it one more time, a little bit louder to make sure everyone heard you.
Yeah. So kids are jumping out of the windows of burning buildings, falling to their deaths, and we think that the problem is they're jumping. And that's the American poverty debate. For 100 years, we've been focusing on the jumpers. We've been focused on the poor. We should have been focused on the fire. Who lit it? Who's warming their hands by it? So this is a book about the fire, There's so much poverty in this land because many of us benefit from it. Some lives are made small, so others may grow. A lot of us consume the cheap goods and services that the working poor produce. A lot of us are invested in the stock market. But when we see our savings go up, sometimes that comes at the cost of a human sacrifice. We have a welfare state that does more to subsidize affluence than to alleviate poverty. And then we have the audacity to ask, how can we afford to cut child poverty? How can we afford to make sure everyone in the country has a doctor? As if the answer wasn't staring us straight in the face. And for many of us, especially those of us who are, white folks above a certain level, we form walls around our community. We build walls, and we continue to embrace segregation and hoard opportunity behind those walls. That's like the story of poverty in America. Yeah.
You said a lot in a little, so I'm going to disentangle a little bit. Let's start with, and one of the arguments in the book I found most provocative, or most counter to the arguments I have with people on Twitter and Facebook and on TV.
You're still in it.
It's this idea about welfare being something that actually middle-class people and upper middle-class people and wealthy people enjoy far more than those who are poor. And in the book, you give us numbers. You give us data. It's not just platitudes. You give us hard numbers based off government data that speaks to all the ways in which we subsidize wealth and upper middle class and middle class living versus what we actually spend to and you make this argument not even to get rid of poverty, but to just soften the impact. So can you walk us through, because I think this audience is eager for, what are the facts? Shock us. How is there welfare? I've never seen a welfare queen that was actually a queen in terms of the tropes, you know? They never look like queens to me, right? But apparently there's queens who are on welfare in this country. So can you walk us through that?
Yeah. Let's talk really specifically maybe about one tax break the mortgage interest deduction. The mortgage interest deduction is an entitlement. If you own a home, you are entitled to this deduction. Last year, we spent $190 billion on homeowner tax subsidies. Most white Americans are homeowners in America. Most black and Latinx Americans are not because of our systematic dispossession of people of color from the land. Most of the mortgage interest deduction goes to families with six-figure incomes. Now let's look at what we do for affordable housing to the most vulnerable families in our community. We spend about $50 billion on everything having to do with affordable housing.
Wait. I'll make sure. 'Cause I'm not a math person, so numbers sometimes get jumbled in my head.
Yeah.
You said $190 billion for what?
$190 billion for homeowner tax subsidies.
Okay. And how much for like people who need help with housing?
$50 billion.
But then we all complain about homelessness. It's wild. Go ahead, please continue.
Right, and it's not an entitlement, right? Only 1 in 4 families who qualify for any kind of affordable housing program receive it. And the waiting list for public housing in this city is not counted in years, it's counted in decades. So we have a universal housing program, it's just not for poor people. And that's repeated over and over and over again in our welfare state. So if you add up everything that the government does for all of us, you count tax breaks, you count social insurance programs, you count means-tested programs like food stamps. Every year, families in the top 20% of the income distribution get about $36,000 from the government. But families in the bottom 20% get about $25,000 from the government. That's a 40% difference. So this is how we do a lot more to guard fortunes than to attack poverty.
And I know the folks in this room are very intelligent, but I have not met the people watching online. So can you say that 36, like what's the differential between what we give people?
Yeah, we're at 36K, 25K. 36K, 25K. Now some folks might be like, well, look, a tax break isn't like a food stamp benefit. And I get it. You know, taxes hurt in America, and they're designed to hurt. But let's think about it. A tax break and a welfare check, they both cost the government money, and they both put money in people's pockets. So if you get the mortgage interest deduction, you could get it by saving on your taxes, or you can get it by the government sending you a check. It would be the same difference. So I think that we do need to start viewing those things as government assistance.
But people worked hard for their mortgages.
Yeah, people worked hard for their public housing too. You know, people work hard for having skin rashes on their fingers from cleaning our offices and homes all day. People worked hard in our fields picking berries and, lifting our old from the beds in their toilets. I mean, there's so many hard workers today in America, plenty below the line, as you know better than I do.
And I want to jump around a little bit. Let's talk about the importance of narrative, right? So I surmise, and this comes from sort of doing guaranteed income work and poverty abolition work, and despite data, no matter where I go, I hear the same arguments about people are lazy, people aren't working, people are making bad choices, people didn't get educated. It's literally the same. I could be in San Francisco, and I could be in Biloxi. I could be in, I'm not going to Florida. I don't want to go. Anyway, I could be places like no matter where I am, or I could be in LA. I could be talking with Democrats, or I could be talking with Republicans. And I hear the same arguments as it pertains to this issue. So we're going to get into laying out the problem a little bit later, but also want to hear your thoughts about, is data enough? How do we shift the mental models we use to explain what we see in terms of so many people having so little in the same place where so many people have so much?
Yeah. Do you think people believe it, or do you think people just say it?
I think people believe it, honestly.
Yeah.
I really think, but people lie to themselves all the time.
Yeah.
So, but I just have been in so many conversations where, with people with Black Lives Matter posters, and stickers on their car, who are like, you know what, I worked hard. People need to work harder, or people are making bad choices, or we spend too much on folks in poverty. We need to focus on the middle class. I've heard that from government leaders who are heralded as progressives. So I do think people believe it.
There's a part of me that feels like when people say that, it's kind of like what Hannah Arendt said about propaganda. It's like, maybe we believe it, maybe we don't, but that organizes us. And I think one way to think about those kind of debates is to make them uncool and boring. And this sounds glib, but there's actually a lot of science behind this. Like, you know, there's a bunch of psychological research that shows that it's easier to change a norm than a belief. And we can feel this in the environmentalist movement. Like, a lot of us care about the environment. Like, we're like, yeah, we're the climate change, you know, yeah. But then, like, you're like, oh, Cheryl put solar panels on her house. So maybe we should probably, she's got solar panels. And I think that the more that we can do that, be like, look, we're kind of done with these boring debates. This is the fire debate. I want to talk about the fire. Let's talk about this. This is I think that is a way to shift the narrative a bit. I think a lot of us on the progressive side of things are very reactive. Like, we don't control the question. And I'd like us to start controlling the question more.
What are some of the questions we should be asking in terms of controlling the question?
So on this score, like, you know, this idea of work and working hard. Is there a culture of poverty in America? Yeah, there is. There's like a culture of exploitation. There's a culture of opportunity hoarding. There's a culture of segregation. There's a culture of like mine and not ours. And I think that that's a way to shift the question. Or if you think about questions about welfare dependence, if you look at the data, you realize immediately that the problem isn't welfare dependence, it's welfare avoidance. The fact that there are billions and billions of dollars of unused aid that's left on the table every year because we do a terrible job as a nation connecting families to programs that they need and deserve. So I think there's ways to subtly shift these questions and to make these old, tired debates boring. And I actually think like we as a country are here. Like it's like that old Gramsci line, like the old is dying, but the new hasn't been born yet. I do think the country is in a different place when it comes to the
Why do you
debate.
think that?
Well, there's data, and then there's just like there's data, and then there's
like
other
vibes,
signals.
like you
There's
feel,
vibes, yeah. So when I wrote my last book, Evicted, I went on the road. I'll tell you a quick story. And I gave this talk in Kansas City, and there was an older gentleman right in the front row, arms crossed, you know, not feeling it. And he got to the mic first, and he was like, "These people don't deserve anything from us. All they deserve is to be sterilized." And he sat down. And what was amazing about that moment to me was how rare that kind of comment was. And I don't just give talks in Berkeley and LA, and how many times I've been in front of audiences and audiences are asking different questions that aren't about work and family, but are about why we as a rich nation tolerate so much scarcity in this land. And I just felt like that was the vibe. And then you look at the data and you learn that like most Democrats and most Republicans now say that poverty is a result of unfair circumstances, not a moral failing. That's huge. Most Democrats and Republicans think the federal minimum wage should be above $15, excuse me. Most Americans believe the rich aren't paying their fair share of taxes. That's kind of encouraging.
So what's the delta between the vibes and the data and the reality? Like what's that missing link?
Movements, I think. Yeah, movements. Like let's look at COVID, right? So COVID hits and the government flexes, right? They do this amazing job.
A Republican-led government too, which was...
Yeah. It was a bipartisan flex. And they did three major things, historic things. They rolled out an eviction moratorium, which decreased COVID death rates by 11%. And then they dropped $46 billion on rental assistance to reach 10 million families and kept evictions lowest on record for months and months and months after that moratorium lifted. They established an extended child tax credit, which is just a wonky way of saying for middle and lower income families, you get guaranteed income. We had a guaranteed income experience in COVID.
Keep trying to tell people.
Yep. Cut child poverty by 46% in 6 months. In 6 months, right? And then they extended unemployment insurance. Congress should have been terrified to take those benefits away. They should have been scared of us. They should have been like, we can't do this. Like, our publics will revolt. But our movements weren't strong enough. You know, the mass movement wasn't there yet.
A couple of answers ago, you mentioned sort of exploitation being a real driver of poverty in this country, and that is what I view as one of the main arguments of the book, that poverty, I think you define poverty at, well, how about this? Here's the question. How do you define poverty?
So officially, poverty is an income level, right? You fall below $27,000 a year, and if you have a family of four, you're officially poor. There's 38 million people that fit that bill in America, which means that if those folks formed a country, that country would be bigger than Australia. But that's not nearly enough, right? 1 in 3 of us live in homes that are bringing in $55,000 or less. A lot of those folks aren't officially poor, but what do you call it? Trying to raise 2 kids in LA on $55,000 or less.
Poor.
Poor. And then, of course, if poverty was just an income level, it would be a much easier problem to address. And it would be much less morally urgent. But poverty is like pain on top of you can't give your kids enough to eat, on top of the nauseating fear of eviction, on top of putting your life in the hands of a public defender, on top of like living with a cockroach infestation that your landlord blames on you, on top of all this misery, pain, and death come early and often. The first 14 years of the 2000s, the richest women in America gained 3 years of life, and the poorest women gained 14 days. And so poverty isn't a line, it's this tight knot of social maladies and humiliations, which should be motivating to us. We should see this as an abomination, I feel.
And I love how in the book you, in addition to that, you also define poverty as like a lack of agency.
Yeah, lack of choice.
Lack of choice, and also this idea that there's a beautiful line where you talk about how we behave, or we like to say that poverty is unseen, but markets have always seen poverty. That our country, from land theft to 400 years of human trafficking, has always seen sort of having a permanent undercast of workers as sacrosanct or an important part of generating wealth for the few. So can you talk more about sort of the argument and the data you have around exploitation being a part of poverty? Particularly, I know you talk about banking, you talk about wages and immigration. So we do all those things, or one of those things. And after that, I want to talk about housing for a little bit.
Got it. So exploitation is a supercharged word, right? People will be like, are you a Marxist? But a lot of us know exploitation in our own life. It's like we just get screwed when we don't have choice, And for a lot of poor folks, they don't have a lot of choice. So if you look at the financial exploitation that goes on, every year, $11 billion are charged in overdraft fees. $1.6 billion is charged in check cashing fees. $10 billion is charged by payday loan fees. That's $61 million pulled out of the pockets of the poor in just fees every day. So like when James Baldwin remarked how expensive it is to be poor, he couldn't have imagined these receipts. Let's look at overdraft fees. Only 9% of bank users are charged 84% of those fees. So who are those unlucky 9%? They're the poor made to pay for their poverty. Who benefits from that? So corporate banks benefit, but a lot of us do too, because our free checking accounts aren't free. They're subsidized by these overdraft fees. So are folks doing that because they're making bad financial decisions and they need just financial counseling? No. They're doing this often because this is the best bad option.
And there's a whole segment of the book where you talk about, and where we got to know and love you through your work and examination of the housing industry in this country. You talk about sort of housing as a wealth-building tool for some, but also as a driver of poverty for so many. So can you talk about the ways in which sort of housing and housing policy, particularly in LA, where everyone talks about homelessness, I have to confess to you, it's refreshing not to be the mayor, because before it was my problem. And now I can say, I'm going to talk to Mayor Bass. That's a good idea for Mayor Bass. Make sure she works on it. So for my friend Mayor Bass,
she's on it.
And for the audience, can you talk about the ways in which housing and the entire industry market helps drive what we're seeing in terms of poverty in this country?
Yeah. So for low-income families, they basically have one choice about where to live. They rent from in the private market, and they give at least half of their income to their landlord and the utility company. 1 in 4 families below the poverty line spend at least 70% of their income on housing cost. They're shut out of homeownership, and they're shut out of public housing.
When you say shut out, who shuts them out?
Banks shut them out. So this might be insane for someone from California to hear, but like last year, 27% of home sales were for under $100,000 in the United States, but only 23% of those sales were financed with a mortgage. And so a lot of folks who could afford those homes aren't given the opportunity to, not because small dollar mortgages are riskier, they're not empirically, but they are less profitable. So if I'm a bank, I would really love to give you a $5 million mortgage. It's going to give me a lot more coin than giving this person an $80,000 mortgage in East St. Louis, for example. So this is a clear way that we can expand choice at the bottom of the market. It's not the only way, but the way we're doing it now is clearly the wrong way.
And what I appreciate about the book is you don't shy away from the conversation about the intersections of race and poverty.
Yeah.
And you talk in specificity about the ways in which sort of, even though poverty may be a shared experience amongst races, that particular groups, Black people, Latino people, undocumented people, et cetera, experience poverty differently and has actually different cascading impacts, and the ecosystem in which that poverty exists is different. So can you elucidate that a little bit for us as well?
Yeah. I mean, racial privileges and racial disadvantages, they go all the way down the economic hierarchy, right? And so the big difference between white poverty and Black poverty in America is there's no concentration of white poverty that mirrors anything that we see that's like the concentration of Black poverty.
When you say concentration, you mean like neighborhoods?
Yeah, like I'm poor, you're poor, you're poor, you're poor. Our whole neighborhood is just very poor. Our school district is poor.
So where do poor white people live?
They live in a lot more economically diverse neighborhoods than poor Black people do.
How?
We are okay with that kind of integration.
Well, I thought that folks in like poor people living next to them. That's what people say all the time. Don't put that on the planning commission agenda. Folks don't want, but is that not the case? Like, can you, is it not just about income? There's also a racial component to that. I want people to walk away very clear. Because I think so many people want to reduce the conversation to just class.
Yeah.
But poverty in this country was never created just by class. There was always a racial component. So.
Yeah.
But I'm not a white professor from Princeton with New York Times bestselling book. So I need you to tell my folks. So please do.
I mean, it's impossible to talk about housing and segregation without talking about our legacy of race, right? Even in our zoning codes, before the Supreme Court made racial segregation illegal, or after they did, I should say, those zoning codes just switched to saying, okay, we're just building homes here and we're building apartments here, and had the same racial effect. And there's a lot of studies that show that, like, you can take a neighborhood and you show white families and Black families different compositions of neighborhoods, right? And a lot of Black families say, this is my ideal neighborhood. It'd be like 50-50, 50% white, 50% Black. They're like, I've totally lived there. And a famous study out of Detroit that showed that, you know, when the average white person sees that neighborhood, they're like, I wouldn't even go in that neighborhood, you know? So segregation is driven by choice, but it's white folks' choice. You know, white folks are the most segregated group in the country, and I think those of us that are living in these segregated affluent communities have to take responsibility for that. I just want to, let me get on the pulpit a little bit just for.
All right, Pastor.
Okay, so this is where the conversation feels abstract, right? But like when I'm talking about tearing down the walls, is I'm talking about those of us who live in those kind of communities go into that Tuesday night zoning board meeting, standing up and being like, look, I refuse to be a segregationist. Like, I'm not going to deny other kids opportunities that my kids have living in this community. I want to build this thing. Now, I don't know if you've all been to a zoning board meeting, but they're violent. They are violent. And this is like not a small thing I'm asking us to do, but this is part of being a poverty abolitionist.
Can I tell you a little story? It'd be, oh yeah, clap for that. In the not so distant past, I looked at the city's budget, and I was like, oh my gosh, we spend more on golf courses that no one uses than libraries for kids. Maybe we should fix that.
Right.
So all I said was, listen, let's get rid of the golf subsidy and use that money to build an affordable housing trust.
How'd it go?
It became World War III. And partly because it became like Michael Tubbs wants to turn golf courses into affordable housing. And honestly, if I thought I was going to be accused for that, I would have did it. But I didn't think I could get that far. I was like, there's no way I could get that far.
I mean, I would vote for that.
No, that's what I'm saying. When it happened, I was like, oh my gosh, I tried to avoid this, but I just should have did it. I'm getting blamed for it anyway.
Right.
But I never saw my community organize in the way they organize around not just this golf course, but like no affordable housing while yelling about the amount of homelessness we had in the community. Like literally, if you go to the golf course now, there's still signs around it that says "Stop Mayor Tubbs," "Stop Mayor Tubbs," "Save the golf course." And people told me to leave golf alone. They said, "Don't do that." But it just seemed like so dumb. Anyway, I think that goes to show that part of the issue, I would argue, and you say this in this book, is that people want to complain about the sickness, but they don't want the cure. Because the cure might go against their beliefs in how the world works. The cure might make them uncomfortable, and the cure might have to make us all think through and confront our own culpabilities. So can you talk about sort of that piece of it as well? That I know a big part of the book is also about, hey, there's structural things, and we're going to talk about that because I love that, but there's also individual ways in which sort of the medicine for this sickness of poverty we see is something we may not be willing to receive.
Yeah, I love the golf course story because it's a lot of like, well, I don't benefit from the government. It's like, cool, can we just take away that 529 tax break then? It's like, of course you can't, like, you know, and then it suddenly is like this visible thing that rises up. And in that kind of debate, right, we feel our complicity. And our values just can't stop where our property lines begin. You know, and you know, there's all sorts of amazing research that shows that when affordable housing is built well, blended into the community, has no effect on our property values. There's incredible research that shows that we can integrate schools that has massive effects on the kids that were outside of our walls before, and it has no effects on the kids that were already inside of those walls, but we still resist it, and we can decorate our walls with our "Don't Tread on Me" flags or our rainbow flags, but the wall remains the wall, indifferent to our decorations. And I think, though, that, like, look, this isn't an everybody wins book, right? This is a book that's about how some of us profit from another person's pain, and we have to divest. We have to divest. But in that divestment, I think we get a better country. Like, I think we get a safer, healthier, happier, more civically vibrant country. So I think that some of us, need to take less from the government. But I think what we gain in that deal is our restored humanity in a way.
And we're in the People's Republic of California.
We are.
And we pride ourselves on being the site of the resistance, right?
Yeah.
Like we pride ourselves on sort of leading the way. And yet, adjusted for cost of living, which is why we started in poverty in California, we have the highest poverty rate in this country. And you have this very enlightening section in the book where you talk about sort of Prop 13 and what that meant for California, but also what that meant for the nation in terms of a narrative shift around taxation and what we owe. And so, like it's not a good question because it's like a 6-part question, but answer which parts you want. Part A, can you speak to sort of, you talk about like what led to Prop 13, like what was driving that? Point 2, can you talk about that answer in relation to this idea that part of our poverty issue is a divestment from the public or from the commons and more retreat to private schools, private security, private at the expense of public infrastructure? Let's start there, and then I'll ask the 4 other follow-ups.
Yeah, Prop 13 passed after a tax revolt in this state with a Democratic governor.
What's a tax revolt?
Tax revolt is basically white homeowners saying no more taxes, no more property tax hikes. We're going to fight this.
You could just do that? It was like a Tea Party thing? Like just throw the tea over the boat? Like you could just say no more taxes and then you get tax reform?
That's literally what Prop 13 is, right?
I wasn't around. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to learn.
I mean, I wasn't either, but some of us in the room benefit from that, right? And it's, I mean, looking outside of your state, it's a little regressive, and it's a little hypocritical, especially to see all this homelessness in the state with a law that freezes your taxes in the year that you bought the home, which means if you bought the home 40 years ago, you're paying basically nothing in property taxes as homelessness spreads around the country and around the state. It seems really hard to defend morally. And this is where this system locks in, which you named, which is this private opulence, public poverty. And this defends a lot of California, I feel. And, you know, private opulence, public poverty is this dynamic that happens when a lot of rich folks live alongside a lot of poor folks, right? And if the rich folks get their way by things like tax breaks and kind of withdrawing...
When you say rich, you're not saying like billionaires.
No.
You're saying like...
we can define it however we like. Maybe top 20%, top 30% of Americans.
Give us a number. I want people to think about themselves.
Top
Like, what's the
20%,
number?
that's
Like,
fine.
how much is that a year? Top 20%.
God, how much is that a year?
Like 300,000,
Sure,
250.
Yeah. The Democrats now define middle class as anyone under $400,000, but let's resist that. And so you withdraw from the public, right? We used to want to be free of bosses. Now we want to be free of bus drivers. And we don't need to use the public parks. We can buy our way into clubs. We don't need to use the pools. We can buy our way into clubs. We don't need to use the schools. We can send our kids to private schools. And as those systems work to divest from one another.
But what drove that? Because I remember reading in history that at one point, post-World War II, we were investing in the public. We were investing in the commons. Like we were investing in a sort of bottom-up economy. So what, in the past, whatever years, drove it to this, what did you say? You said private opulence, public squalor?
Yeah.
Like what drove that? Did everyone just wake up one day and say, you know what, skip the public? Like how did we come to that conclusion?
Yeah. We invested in certain parts of the public, right, after World War II. You know, the GI Bill was 16% of the federal budget. We haven't had a provision bigger than that ever since, but that was directed mostly at white veterans, right? Black folks were shut out because of redlining and because of local VA banks that refused to do good on the mortgages. And once we had that massive public investment in building a white middle class, a few decades later, we had a rise of a certain kind of republicanism, a certain kind of politics that wanted less taxes and wanted to roll back those public gains. And so, you know, the tax revolt started in California in the late 70s, then it led to the election of Ronald Reagan, which had this massive, the biggest tax cut in American history. And that kind of led to this kind of like giant shift in America between us getting richer and the public getting poorer. So this is kind of wonky, but like if you follow all the money, you see that there's been this 9% drop in public spending since 1950 and a gain in private incomes. And you're like, a 9% drop, what is that? That's trillions and trillions of dollars taking out of the public sphere. And so in California, just to speak specifically, after Prop 13 failed, you know, California public schools had to cut summer programs. You know, property owners were the winners, but the kids were really the losers.
The future, right? It was a mortgage on our future. All right, so enough of this. Oh, you want to talk about check cashing places a little bit before we talk about solutions? Just to orient us in the problem, or is there any other part of the problem you want to speak about before we get to like hope and solutions?
So much problem.
I know.
Yeah.
Only so little time.
But also, I think I don't want to do that thing, like that thing we do when we like read the newspaper, like, oh, this is terrible. Next, you know. So like, it is a giant problem, but it's incredibly within our reach. Maybe this is my solution transition.
I want to talk about the problem just a little bit more, though. Only because, and I think you do this so well, like I think we become immune to poverty. It's just a word that's divorced of meaning or context or anything that we could touch or feel. So I just want to make sure before we get to solutions that we are very, very clear about the problem, about how it's intersectional, multifaceted, how it's driven by policies, how it's driven by individual choices, and how it's ubiquitous. It's in the wage we set. That's the minimum. That's a policy choice. That's not enough to pay for housing anywhere. It's driven by sort of choices made to exclude certain types of workers from New Deal protections. And those same industries are still suffering today and disproportionately populated by women of color. It's driven by, as you mentioned, a benefit system where we say, hey, let's allocate billions of dollars to address this problem, but then make it hard for those who need the billions of dollars to access the benefits. And maybe we start there, because I think for a lot of folks in the room who do work in government, I know we have the mayor of Santa Monica here, I think, and the councilman for Santa Monica, so thank you all so much for being here. But so much of the conversation in policy circles is about this idea of stigma, that people aren't applying for benefits because there's a stigma attached to it. But in your book, you talk about it's not stigma, it's program design. And I know Epic's been doing a lot of work on that, but could you talk more about the findings and the research around what's actually driven? And I'll be quiet after this, but there was a study done by USC last year that talked about how if folks in LA County just were able to draw down all the benefits they qualify for, poverty would be at functional zero with no new expenditures. Just making sure the money that we allocated for the problem went to folks. So can you speak to why that's not happening based off your research?
Yeah, we're going to get into the weeds a little bit.
We got to.
Yeah. So 1 in 5 elderly people in America who qualify for food stamps don't get them. 1 in 5 workers in America who qualify for the earned income tax credit, which is this bump that poorly paid workers get every year, don't apply for it. If you add up all the money in America that's left on the table because people aren't reached by these programs, you learn that every year low-income folks are passing on over $140 billion. Just a giant sum of money that's left on the table. Why? So we used to think it was stigma, but if you look at the data, you realize that just doesn't cut it. Basically 100% of families who qualify for food stamps in Oregon get them. And here in California, it's only about 63%. So is food stamps way more stigmatized here than it is in Oregon? No. Oregon just does a way better job than you guys do getting folks connected to food stamps. We've made these programs confusing. We've made them hard to apply for. We make people renew every single year, and often that kicks people off the rolls. So this is incredibly frustrating on the one hand, especially living in the epicenter of global capitalism, where if we know how to do anything, we know how to market things to people and get stuff to people. But it's also very hopeful, because it means that these small tweaks can have big effects. There are studies that show that literally increasing the font on an application and making it less wordy, giant uptakes in people applying for the earned income tax credit. Just connecting to the elderly American to someone on the phone for half an hour to walk them through the food stamp application, giant uptake in that. So I think that we have to start investing in these programs, and I would love it to be just as easy for someone who qualifies for unemployment insurance to nail it and to get it as it is for me to order dog food or birdseed on my phone and have it delivered tomorrow.
Right? Tell me what. So sadly, I got the look. It's time to wrap it up. So I have time for 2 more questions, and then we have time for audience questions. So first question, can you speak to solutions? And I'm going to be a little prescriptive in my question. Can you speak particularly to the IRS's role, potentially, in generating income to solve for poverty in this country? And about my baby, guaranteed income. Thank you.
If there's any Hollywood people in the room, I would love a movie about a badass IRS agent who just cracks down on the billionaires, just float it out there. Study was published recently that showed if the top 1% of Americans just paid the taxes they owed, not paid more taxes, just paid what they owed, that we as a country could raise an additional $175 billion a year. That's almost enough to pull everyone out of poverty. That's enough to reestablish the child tax credit that did so much in COVID. That's enough to double and then double again our investment in affordable housing. We can do this. We have the resource to do this. And so a guaranteed income, which is basically a floor that no one should fall below, no matter what, like no matter what. You know, there's a lot of times we qualify that. Like if you work, you shouldn't, no, I don't think anyone should. That doesn't mean we're all equal or that hard work isn't rewarded, but that means that like there isn't this level of degradation and indignity that we tolerate. I love that idea, and we can fund that idea. I also think we need to start building out permanent solutions to address exploitation in the labor market, in the housing market, and the financial market. We need to expand worker empowerment and expand the choice about where people live and how they access money and credit. There's a ton of ways to do that. We can get into the weeds if you want. And then we have to tear down the walls. We have to tear down the walls. And we have to start reaching for open, broad communities. I think that's the 3 steps to end poverty in the US.
You heard it here first. Thank you. As we prepare for audience questions, so be thinking of good ones, though, that end in a question mark. No editorializing. You didn't write the book. I don't want to hear it. Question. But last question for you. Is there anything you want the audience to take tonight? There's such an urgent voice in the book around, like, we have to do it. It's almost like a prophetic voice, if you will. Like, we have to do something. We have to do something. So if you have any, like, a 2-line or a 1-line zinger for this audience, like, you came here in the rain for half the day to sit and listen for an hour. Here's what I wanted you to get from this conversation.
Yeah, I have a website, actually. So we built this website. We just launched it. It's called End Poverty USA. You can also go to an amazing website that's called End Poverty in California. But End Poverty USA is about a way that people connect with anti-poverty movements. And there's an amazing anti-poverty movement right in your own backyard led by Mr. Tubbs. And so I just think that one way we can get involved in this fight is literally to get involved in these fights. Now, some of you might be like, well, I'm like not like that. Like I don't march in the street and stuff. And like, I'm not like that either. But like movements need accountants, movement needs lawyers, movements need marketers and film directors. They even need writers, God help them. And so I think that whatever our lot in life, we can get plugged in. And I think we should get plugged in not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's fun. It's joyous. It's a beautiful thing to be a part of. Can I tell you a quick story as a way of transition? So I was hanging out with this group called United Renters for Justice in Minneapolis right before COVID. And they were a group of immigrants, undocumented immigrants that communicated using Google Translate app. And they were fighting a landlord. And they were trying to buy their apartments back from him. And it all came to a head, and the landlord moved to evict all of them. And they raised $7 million to buy the building back. But the eviction case was going through. And this woman named Chloe went first. Her case was first. And everyone showed up. Everyone in those buildings showed up. And they brought tamales and pizza, and they made it into like this. They were like, you're not standing alone. And when the jury was, deliberating, this woman named Takara turned to me and she was like, I think that they're taking so long because they've forgotten how to dream. You know, they were like asking themselves why this raggedy building. And Chloe won. And she told me, before we were just neighbors and now we're a family. That's like an irresistible way to live, I think, in this country.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
At Live Talks Los Angeles, questions typically begin with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short, and this is not a place where we believe in 2-part questions. So who would like to go first?
Academics are out, I guess. Yeah, man.
Matthew, I'm curious what got you into this to begin with. Like, what deep down motivated you to start researching this, and then what has changed over time as you've written your books?
I think one thing that got me into this is what I saw in Milwaukee for my last book. Like I saw grandmas living in trailers without heat in Wisconsin in the winter and just staying under blankets and praying that the space heaters didn't go out. I went on this eviction move once with the sheriff. It was like a day like this, like a rainy, cold day. And they went to evict this home and it was just kids living in there, just kids. And the mom had died and the kids had just gone living in the house. and they evicted the kids. And they put all their stuff on the curb, and someone called social services, and we were off to the next eviction. I think that kind of, seeing that part of America infected me and moved me. What's changed since I saw that? I think this unrelenting urge to figure out the why question. I think books like my last one bear witness. They show the human toll of poverty in America, but they can't answer the why question. Because the why question, you have to look at the fire. So this book is trying to change that aperture. And as a writer, it was challenging for me. I don't really like writing outside of things I can't directly see, but I thought, a book like this was kind of needed and necessary.
Where we are sitting and holding this talk today, there was a plan to build 30 development projects, 3 million square feet of housing, a considerable amount of covenanted affordable housing, and 100% affordable housing projects. The county even built a train station right there outside of this place to serve this new housing village. However, there was a significant pushback to this plan, and eventually council members caved in and stopped it altogether. So how do elected officials do the right thing, and even sometimes going against what the majority of the population may demand them to?
Sometimes we think the majority is the majority, but they're not. There's a really great book called Neighborhood Defenders. Academic book, but it's smart. And it shows that a lot of the folks that are showing up and are giving the council a lot of grief are not representative of the broader community. They're whiter, they're richer, and they're homeowners. And if you survey the broader community, a lot of folks are down with these projects, which means I think we have to rethink how to do democracy in a way. And the way we do democracy actually has this undemocratic process because it elevates the more privileged folks that are willing to defend the wall. So I think that it's kind of not asking them to go against the will of the people. It's asking them to actually get the will of the people in a way that they're not getting today, I think. Yeah.
Hey guys, I work in affordable housing because of your book, so thank you.
Wow, thank you. Yeah.
My question's about this goal of, if you want to raise money about a program, we usually create more programs, right? It ends up being more complicated and it layers more regulation on top of each other. And that gets away from getting benefit in the hands of people that need it, right? So how do we get away from funding new programs, but getting the existing programs we have better funded and actually in the, in the hands of the people that need it?
Yeah. I think one thing that we're doing is we're not addressing the root causes of poverty. So often we're spending more to stay in the same place. So if you look at the budget for HUD over the last 20 years, inflation-adjusted spending on affordable housing has increased by 16% over the last 20 years. But the number of families served by HUD has stayed the same. Why? Because the biggest thing we're doing is housing vouchers, and rent has increased by about 16% over the last 20 years. It's a good recipe to spend the same to stay in the same place. I think housing vouchers are essential, right? I wrote a book calling for an expansion of them, but it's clear that we need to build out these more permanent, durable solutions, or else we kind of get to this place where we're struggling. And so that means things like homeownership ramps in housing. It means expanding land trust. It means investing in public housing. In the labor market, it means finding ways to make organizing easy and trying to organize entire sectors instead of going one Starbucks at a time.
Hi.
Hi.
I came here today from Milwaukee.
You came from Milwaukee?
Yeah.
You flew from Milwaukee?
No, I took the train.
That's amazing.
I agree. It was amazing. But I wanted to thank you, of course, for your book and for the work you did in Milwaukee, and tell you that things are getting better. Now, they're not perfect, but I don't know if are you following it still a little bit?
I'm sorry, I'm just thinking I'm going to be in Chicago in a couple weeks.
It would have been easier, right?
It's really nice to meet you too. I hope you came for the great weather.
Yeah, I did.
I mean, tell us one thing about Milwaukee that you're excited about.
Well, that things are getting better. We're building public housing in the suburbs, if you can even imagine such a thing. But we are. It's starting. It's not perfect, but it's starting.
In progressive Milwaukee.
Go figure.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, we have a new mayor and we have a new county exec, and they're working hard. Do you know about our county exec and our new mayor?
Yes.
So they're good people, and they're working very hard at this. And you started it all, and so I thank you.
Oh, thanks for coming. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. I was wondering how you could kind of give guidance on helping navigate like the two ways you can address this problem. One being, like, there's these walls, and you can, start breaking down the walls. You can create new policies and, change taxation, or you could, on the other side, kind of like help building like this step ladder so people can look over the wall and, help people access the funds that are already existing. There seems like there's like this two ideas, like incrementalism and trying to like improve, like very slowly, improving access and things like that. And then there's changing the whole system and like changing taxation, changing how we think about giving people the funds that they need to survive. So I was just wondering how you think about those two different camps in terms of, we can't do everything. Which is it? Some people should do some and some people should do the other, or how do you think about that problem?
I think we can do everything. When LBJ launched the War on Poverty, they set a deadline. Like they were like, we got this, 1976, we got this. And like they cut poverty in half with the Great Society and War on Poverty. So we used to be like, we got this, we could do it all. And so I think that I'm very suspicious of statements about practicality, because it's like the dreams of the rich are often realized. Like, wouldn't it be great if we could like take a bunch of money and like put it on an island and like not pay taxes on it? Be like, yes, that's how the world works. But the dreams of the poor are often seen as outlandish, and ridiculous and Pollyannish. And this idea of like that very serious people say, well, in a world of scarce resources. But that's not our world. Your economy in the state is bigger than Canada's. And so I think we need to find a language to resist that scarcity division. There's this little fable that I write in the book, and it's like there's a dog sitting on a pile of hay and growling at the cows who try to eat it. And the farmer feeds the cows by like snatching up the sides of the hay a little bit, and the cows, don't get enough to eat. They get emancipated. And that's kind of how we do anti-poverty policy, but we should just move the dog.
When I was a bartender in New Orleans, I made $2 an hour and 13 cents on the clock plus tips. And then when I lived in Las Vegas later, my girlfriend and a couple other friends worked in restaurants and made $14, $15 an hour plus tips and had health care, job protections, paid leave, because there was a union.
Yeah, sounds
and
better.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, sectoral bargaining, that stuff.
Yeah. Want me to take that one? Yeah.
I asked the questions tonight.
You asked
so
first. Okay, you're like, you're out enough. So there was a time in the country when 1 in 3 of us were in a union, and that was the most economically equitable time in the country. And then we were told the story that like, well, unions make the economy less productive. And so we tried something new, and we destroyed the unions, and our economy got less productive, actually. The economy was more productive in the 60s and 70s than it is today. And so we got the inequality, but we didn't get the market dynamism. And then we have this problem of we've made unionization like really hard. And if any of you have been part of a union drive, you know how like frustrating and hard it is. The National Labor Board reviewed union drives and found that about 50% of cases, employers are doing illegal stuff, including firing people and threatening to move shop to break up union drives. There was amazing reporting in the New York Times that showed that Amazon literally changed the timing of the stoplights so that union organizers couldn't go up to the cars leaving the parking lot. And so how can we make unionizing easier? So one idea that came out of a group called Clean Slate for Worker Power, which is a great report that I highly recommend, was this thing called secretarial bargaining, which is in Europe. And it's like this. What if all the folks that are not just in Amazon, but warehouse workers around the country voted? And if enough of them voted, the Secretary of Labor would start a process. And there would be worker representatives from the warehouses and corporate representatives, and they would collectively bargain together, and they would reach an agreement, and that agreement would cover every warehouse worker in the entire sector. And that's one way to organize not just this warehouse and this warehouse and this warehouse, but all of them at once. This has been massively effective in Europe, and I think it could be a great way to move forward here.
I'm really interested in some of the suggestions that you made in the past, but talking about how they were kind of short-term, or like we had the war on poverty. We've tried building public housing, and then we kind of lose steam, and you talked a little bit about movements. And I'm really curious the role that maintenance and movement maintenance, but then also continuing to fund programs and policies, how important that is, and not to let the shiny projects kind of leave with the last presidential administration or mayoral administration. But what role does maintenance play within poverty abolition?
That's a really great, hard question for me, I think. Part of the way I approach that question is wondering if those of us in movements and those of us who are progressives have embraced a kind of cynicism or nihilism lately that's incredibly bad for movement maintenance. If you look at what happened during COVID, like just in my world, in the eviction defense world, the emergency rental assistance, right? It took a while to get off the ground. You can't drop $46 billion from a plane. And so some states got the money out quickly, some states didn't. And when that was happening, when it was like lumbering and stumbling, and everyone was tweeting about it, everyone was writing about it. The New York Times called emergency rental assistance slow as molasses. Planet Money ran a story called The Rent Relief is Too Damn Slow. And then it started working, and evictions started going down, and they stayed down, and it reached 1 million families, then 2 million, then 10 million, and no one said anything. And that's on us, I feel. And I feel like it wasn't the mountaintop, but it was a very high vista, and we should have celebrated that win. And I think that those of us on the progressive side of things are very fluent in the language of critique and often bumbling in the language of celebration and promise. And I think that we need to reclaim that language a little bit too. The movement has to be irresistible. And I think that we need to help contribute to that irresistibility. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the Poor People's Campaign and how that fits into the effort and the movement.
It fits perfectly. It's a wonderful campaign. And I think that the Poor People's Campaign is one of several anti-poverty movements afoot. And it's an exciting time to be alive on this. You have amazing leaders in California. You have amazing leaders in the labor space. We have a new housing movement that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. We have a labor movement that's finally like multiracial and nimble and smart. And so I think that the Poor People's Campaign is part of that larger tent. And what I love about Reverend Barber's movement is he talks about this as a morally intolerable issue. And that he talks about poverty as a sin. And when I hear questions like, how can we afford it? I hear a sinful question. So I think that they're my teachers and my mentors, yeah. Thank you. Thanks, brother. I appreciate you. Thank you, sir. Yeah.